Welcome everybody to today's episode of the Conscious Grief series. I am very honoured to be here with Emma Cannon, who is a fertility intuitive, a trauma healer, a master acupuncturist with 25 years experience. And Emma is in London, so a fellow Brit, and I'm very, very happy to meet you. Thank you for being here, Emma.
Absolute pleasure. Lovely to share space with you.
Yeah. The first question that I like to start with is really asking each person I'm interviewing what their definition of grief is.
Okay, I think that grief is really how we pay tribute, how we honor the things that we hold dear in our life. So the loss of the things that we hold dear in our life. It's that recognition of the importance of what they were to us, whether we knew it at the time or not. And that's probably where some of the grief comes in sometimes, is through the regret. But it's the loss of those things that we hold dear. And I was sort of tuning into this morning, and I sort of had this idea of somebody with a sort of a learner sticker on their back. I think this idea that people should probably know when people are grieving. So I guess that's why people used to wear black.
Mm.
Um, but how do we represent that in the modern day? So it was just funny because I was brushing my teeth and kind of thinking about grief, and I had this sort of learner sticker on my back because I'm learning to grieve my sister.
Mm.
Um, and so it's a learning, and it's a yearning as well.
Yeah.
But it's most of all, it's an honoring, I feel.
Yeah, I completely agree with you about I guess you see now a lot of people using Instagram to really share their grief. And I think that's maybe a new way of wearing black in some sense of being on social media. But it's true, in the past, people would have outwardly shown it and everyone would have known. And then over years, we've just become a lot more detached from it and wanting to sort of soldier on and not slow down and let it define us,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
perhaps moved us away from the experience.
Yeah, and I think that we for a period of time, I think that's changing now. I think we became people that suppressed and repressed our emotions, and I think we're seeing the damage and the outpouring of that now because they can only be contained for so long. And I think grief is particularly something that's difficult for people to talk about, and even when they know it's coming, it's difficult to prepare. I mean, everybody has that experience of knowing that somebody is going to die, but but even when it happens, it's still really difficult.
Yeah, it's still a shock, and everybody has such a unique expression or experience, I think. Now, I saw on your website that your father died when you
Yeah.
were 16, and there was this really lovely sort of tribute that you gave to him, that he encouraged you as a young girl that everybody has their own unique gift, and it's our duty to find it and then share it with the world. I would love to hear some more about that.
Yeah, he was great. I mean, he was a bit of a thought pioneer, really. If you think he died in 1984, and also he was a general in the army. So I suppose the archetypal image of that is somebody who was very, powerful and strategic, and yeah, I mean, he probably was all of those things, but he was also an incredibly compassionate man. And I would say that he really led with compassion and he led with his heart. And I think that was probably quite unusual for the times. But ironically, since he had many men serving under him, he had five daughters, and he always said that his daughters were there to teach him. Again, really, you know, ahead of his times for the sort of 70s and 80s, really. But yeah, he used to tuck me up in bed and say, we all have a gift. The really lovely thing about that is I just used to look at around me, and he said, sometimes the gift isn't obvious, you know, but you'll see it in people because it's a sparkle. Actually makes me want to cry. And so I would see it in, you know, in the, sorry if people don't know what a lollipop lady is, but lollipop lady or man, lollipop person probably they're called these days, is somebody that helps children across the road in busy streets, usually in front of a school and things like that. But then I would see it in the lollipop person, and I would see this sort of glint in their eye at the joy of doing what they did, or obviously, you know, an opera singer or an actress, or, and I was really always drawn to these people, no matter what it was that they were doing, but there was something about them, the way that they were doing it, that for me was the gift. And I'm pretty sure that that's what he meant, which in and of itself was a gift to me, because it drew me to the light, you know, it drew me to the, not to the ambition and the success, but it just drew me to the magic. And I'm very, very grateful for that.
Yeah, what an amazing influence to have.
Yeah,
How did
yeah.
you kind of, what led you to doing the acupuncture and the work that you do today?
By engaging in my own magic, really, and by, you know, by understanding what my unique skills were, and finding a way to get someone to pay me for doing it. Really, I mean, someone said to me the other day, how did you get on this path that you're on? I said, path? There's no path. I laid every pebble myself. um, so there was no path, but I think that what I did was, well, what I did first of all was the complete opposite. I did everything that I was really, really bad at, that I really wasn't suited to, that was really uncomfortable and painful for probably myself and everyone around me. So that's what I did first of all. And so I worked for an oil company, I worked for a very corporate company, and it was just didn't make my heart sing at all. And I wasn't particularly good at it, but the money was really good. But luckily I was made redundant. And funnily enough, I did a little blog on this the other day because I found some old photos when I was clearing out. And then I was approached in the street and asked to be a Madonna lookalike, would you believe? Because I did in the 80s or 90s look very like Madonna. It was the early 90s. And I did that probably for a couple of months, did some photos. They asked me to do things like nip down a, you know, a shopping arcade in a spot the lookalike competition. I was like, no, I can't sing a note anyway. So I think my career would have been very short-lived. And then so I sort of thought, no, this isn't my gift. That wasn't my gift. This isn't my gift. And then I went to San Francisco, and I arrived in San Francisco at a really incredibly potent time. It was the early 90s, the Gulf War had just broken out. It was a big resurgence of really the hippie movement and all of the healing arts that went with that, none of which I'd been exposed to in 1980s London. And it just lit me up. I listened to people like Ram Dass talk. I was lucky enough to see him a couple of times, and some of the forerunners of something called the Hoffman process here. So that they hold it all over the world, I'm sure. But so some of the really early body mind people, psychotherapy type stuff, all the stuff about food, I hadn't been exposed to any of it. And then I took myself to San Francisco, and I just was like, this is what I want to do. This lights me up. And that was it. I came back to London, and London really didn't care about anything like that at the time. And I slowly and surely followed my heart and stuck at it.
Amazing. It's so interesting to hear how, people's journeys, actually. I think that's a whole other series in itself. And I know that on your journey, on your page, on your website, that you also felt that you sort of inhabit this place in between the living and the dying. And that was such a curious sentence for me. So you talk about the teachers that you had. So could you talk a little more to that?
I mean, it's a pretty curious thing for me to make a mistake about it. Well, the one thing is I've apparently been dying since 2005. I mean, we all have, but I got a cancer diagnosis in 2005 and really thought my days were numbered. Where are we now? 16 years later, I'm still here, having been through a fair amount. I mean, I think I've probably had 60 plus chemotherapy sessions. I've had radiotherapy. I think I've had 15 radiotherapies to my brain. I had radiotherapy to my breast. I've had like major operations to remove certain parts of me. So I think that my way of coping with that has always been to be able to face death and to be able to face loss. Because if you've been dying for a long time, you go through different levels of grief continually. So there is always a process of letting go. One of the first, I'll tell you the first memory I have of letting go. And it was when I was very first diagnosed. And it was a very simple thing, but it seemed like a very important thing at the time. I really didn't know how long I was going to live then. And I had a 3-year-old daughter and an 8-year-old daughter. And I would read the bedtime stories. But I just thought it's better now that I allow my husband to read the bedtime stories, because that's an easier transition for everybody if anything were to happen for me. And I think what I did was just a process of that upon that upon that. Now, I didn't, but at the same time, I also really lived my life. So I wrote 4 books in the sort of 7 years after my diagnosis. My practice became really popular and full and busy, and magazines wanted to write about me. So all the outer stuff was all very happening and successful, but there was also this underlying thing at the same time as really living. So no one would look at me and say she's not living. As far as anyone else was concerned, I'm probably one of the most alive people they might know. But at the same time, I was also preparing to die in little ways. So, but they were subtle, beautiful ways. They weren't like, I'm going to die, so I'm going to do this. They were just subconscious or unconscious. And I think that that's what I mean in that you're able to inhabit both. So even now, my prognosis is quite bad from the medical point of view, but I'm still have a year-long mentorship that I'm running, but at the same time, I make sure my affairs are in order, and I do all the spiritual stuff that I feel I need to do to help prepare my family and myself for me passing. So I'm with grief,
Yeah.
I'm with it rather than avoiding it.
Yeah.
So I think that's what I mean. And I have the ability to sort of leave the planet a bit. Sometimes I feel like I'm not actually here. So that's what I mean, really.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's very clear.
Well, thank you, because I've never really had to articulate it. So it's actually a really beautiful process to try and articulate what I mean by that.
Yeah, and I think, I think it's so powerful. I sometimes think for myself, having gone into really looking at death, or my father died actually today, 31 years ago, on the 20th of April, and I was 9. So having that loss early in life, I was always sort of thinking about death, and always really living my life like, well, I don't know how long I'm going to be here. So, if I don't enjoy what I'm doing, I'm going to change it. I'm not going to keep on doing things that I don't like. So I think in some ways, living with death very close to you, you can live more fully, ironically. Like, a lot of people would think that that's a very sort of sad place to live from, but it can make you live more courageously. I believe.
Totally. Yeah, I believe that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, I do believe that too. Certainly I do. I would say I do. It's been quite hard to do that in lockdown, but but I do try and do that for sure.
Yeah. And I was thinking about your work with with women who are struggling with fertility, because there is so much grief in that, isn't
Yeah.
there? So I just
Yeah.
wondered if there's anything you wanted to share about women who may be in that struggle at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, just to quantify what you say, I mean, there is so much unseen grief there. And I think just because often these women aren't ill, it doesn't mean to say they don't suffer and they don't struggle, and men too, of course.
Mm.
There's, it's often such a strongly held dream to be a mother and to have a child, and yeah, when that's not achieved, that that's can be devastating, because it's like, how do I be in the world, how do I be in the world now? But all the losses that go along the way to coming to that point anyway, whether you're successful or not, there's often a whole load of grief. I mean, I think there's mini grief every month. You go through this sort of cycle of the egg not taking, or not becoming pregnant. So there's a mini loss, but then there's within that there's bigger loss, and obviously the ultimate. Well, I don't want to put it as a hierarchy, but like, let's say the ultimate of losing a child. And I think sometimes that's a very hard darkness for people to be with and sit with and hold that space. Um, and what a lot of people say to me is, they feel even more isolated because no one can hold that space for them. So if you are someone that is able to be near the darkness, which you obviously are and I am, because it's in our makeup, it's part of who we are. And then there's a comfort in that for people. And it's just to sit in that space and not to try and fix it or make it better for that person, but just to say, I'm here.
Yeah, totally. Because everybody, and even I can fall prey to it, even having the knowledge that I have. We say things because we want to move that person out of the feeling immediately, or and really we just need a space to be held and supported, and for no one to try and fix it. So
Yeah. I mean, I think that's something that the muggles, as I call them, not touched by grief or pain, which however many of them are.
the
Muggles, in Harry Potter, the human people are the muggles, and the so for people, who, it's obviously often well meant, but exactly as you say, I think if society could learn something, it's just to acknowledge, to be able to acknowledge, to be able to say, I don't know what to say, but I'm here for you.
Mm,
Um, and I can't imagine how difficult it is, just that, rather than, I just know it's going to be okay, or everything happens for a reason, or all that sort of toxic positivity, as I call it, because all that does is it denies the person the opportunity to be with what is, which in
yeah,
that moment might be the grief, but in 2 minutes time it might be something completely else.
100%.
um, so I think acknowledgement is something we should all learn at school.
Emotional intelligence. That would have been a class that I might have done quite well in, but
Yeah,
the academic ones. Um,
yeah,
so you
quite.
must see from your work a lot of tears on
Yeah,
your tables. And I was thinking actually how acupuncture brought me to having therapy. And
yeah,
I was going to a clinic in London, and I remember the lady saying, acupuncture can bring up a lot of emotion. And so we have a therapist here for clients to go and see. So just to let you know that that's a service that we have. And I was like, I don't need to go and see anyone, you know. It's like, I didn't need that. And then, you know, that was a really important part of my journey, because I did go and see that lady, and I was finally ready, you know, to talk about things. And that was in my late 20s, and she was just this most special lady. So I was so grateful actually to that clinic, because in a way, sometimes we need to go a different route, don't we? Rather than think, you know, if we have some body work or acupuncture, and that starts to help us to open up. And I was thinking, do you, just because I'm talking about grief all the time at the moment, whether there's any relationship between perhaps having problems with getting pregnant and having repressed grief?
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, for sure. And I think so. Yeah, for sure. I mean, the mechanisms will be different according to the person. And again, it really depends on how traumatic the grief was, because we can have trauma in our life, but we can process it if we're supported really well, as you know. It's more about the support that the person received at that time. So if the grief was received and processed by the body as a trauma, then I think that there's more likelihood of there being problems. And I also believe that we carry within us these sort of grief and miasms of generations and generations. And particularly when you talk about grief, because grief is something that's in the lung, and it's a very sort of ancestral energy. You know, it's one of the energies that we do inherit from our ancestors. And there's stuff in epigenetics about this around the lung energy, I think. I go all expansive now, and then I'm like, oh, I better have my scientific head on. But you know, there's good evidence that what affects us in the womb can affect us, you know, as human beings, as adults. So you know, if your mother had a loss while she was carrying you, you know, that will impact the epigenetics and perhaps predispose you to certain, you know, I don't want to be so literal about it, but in Chinese medicine, we might say that that might affect the lung energy of the child and the capacity towards grief and the propensity towards grief, or whatever, the ability to deal with grief or process it. So yes, I mean, I really do believe that we can inherit traits, that we have ancestral traits, but also early grief in our own life can also affect us, for sure. I think it's probably through the immune system and through our system of fight or flight, and whether we feel safe in the world, and that sort of mechanism. So, for example, the fight or flight mechanism is a sort of danger, it's a survival place to be. But if we constantly feel at some level that we're under threat or we're not safe in the world, which of course grief can make us feel like that, then that mechanism is probably switched on too much, which tells the body that it's not safe, that it's not a good time to conceive, for example. Whereas if we are in the feed or breed, which is more when everything is switched off, we feel safe, we feel secure. That's why the sort of whole touching and stroking and orgasm, all of those things are really important, because they flood the body with endorphins and dopamine and serotonin, all of which make the body feel safe. If you're peeing on a stick, you're absolutely terrified that you've left it too late. You're trying to squeeze in sex at you know, time when you're exhausted and your partner's exhausted and doesn't want to do it. None of that creates a sense of safety and security. It's all stress.
Totally.
Yeah.
Do you think there's quite a strong parallels because you're also a trauma coach, between trauma and grief?
Yeah. So grief can be experienced as a trauma.
Yeah. And are you treating the trauma with acupuncture as well as coaching?
Yeah, so it's not really coaching that I do, but we just call it that because it's like, what else do you call it? But I guess it's a form of coaching. But it's a process that I learned through Gabor Mate called compassionate inquiry. What you do is you whatever is coming up for you in this life, or if you keep falling into the same patterns, you use an incident to retrace the feelings in the body. So say you had a really strong reaction to somebody, and one of those situations where you go, God, that's a bit embarrassing, I can't really believe I reacted that strongly, or I burst into tears and ran to my bedroom, or whatever it was you did. You feel into the body. So where is this showing up in my body? Okay, it might be in the heart. So I would encourage you to sort of stay with that feeling, that sensation in the body. And then you trace it. You say, is there an emotion attached to it? And then they bring up the emotion. You let them sit in that emotion for a bit, so really connect them to the feeling in the body. So the idea is, so then next time it happens, there's a familiarity. And then you say, and is this the first time that you felt this? And then you say, if you were to know, when did you first feel this? And go back to a memory. And then normally you go, the pathway, the neural pathway will take you to something that happened, something traumatic, something that wasn't dealt very well. And it could be something that you've completely forgotten about. Sometimes it's like, oh, when I got that really bad result in my exams, or when this girl who's really competitive with me got full marks and I got that's not me because I'm not very competitive, but but these sorts of things that come up. Oh, someone made me really laugh the other day. It took them back to a memory where they got a poorer result than their friend, and she was brought up in a very competitive household, and that was part of the problem, of course. Anyway, and the trauma was that her dad had said to her, yes, but look at the size house that we have and the car we have compared to them. So not only did he not acknowledge her disappointment, but he also hijacked it for his own ego. I would thought that was brilliant. That could go down in the what not to do as parents, right? Anyway, so we kind of, and then what we did is we put new data. So how could he have dealt with it? Well, he could have given me a hug and bought me an ice cream and sort of said, never mind, you're brilliant anyway, and you only got one, it's not about what she does, it's about what you do. And it's about you finding your gift in the world. There are any number of things that could have happened in that situation which wouldn't have resulted in a trauma. So you put new data into the brain, and then you kind of bring it back to the current day. So yeah, that's how that works. And I do it a lot with grief as well.
Yeah.
And then I also use acupuncture, because what the acupuncture does is it almost cements that. You don't have to do it with acupuncture. During lockdown I didn't do it with acupuncture, but in clinic I would do it with acupuncture, because it sort of consolidates that sort of change in energy. It solidifies it, and it really sort of puts it into the body. So yeah.
So good. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really good. It's kind of made up. I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only one that does it, but I kind of like to take a method and make it my own.
Yeah, and it sort of sounds a bit like sort of, that like in inner child work and
Yeah.
reparenting yourself.
Mm.
So I was curious about how our body holds on to grief, what we can do to, I mean, the things that you're talking about, helping release it. But is there things that we might manifest in our body through shutting down, shutting off our grief?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really interesting to read the Chinese medicine stuff around the emotions like anger and grief. It's really profound. I mean, when I started reading that stuff, I just fell in love with it, because I was like, this really makes sense to me more than anything I've ever really read. It was so emotionally intelligent. And so let's talk about what the Chinese say about grief. They talk about grief being in the lungs. So grief sits in the lungs. And if you think about how our lungs function, they breathe in and they let go. They take in and they let go. It's this constant cycle of renewal. So when we think about grief like that, that really helps us as well, because it's not like it's a natural cycle of things. It's a natural cycle of life. And so within that, there's an acceptance that it's not normal. It might be shocking, it might be sad, but it is a normal process. And what we see often, and often in elderly people, if one dies, they've been together all their life, then the other can sometimes die in the next couple of months, and it's often through pneumonia or lung related things. So grief really sits on the lungs. So it can really, we can have coughs, we can have um, asthma, that kind of thing, anything affecting the lungs. But also on a behavioral level, well, the absolute ultimate extreme is the hoarder. And have you ever seen documentaries about hoarders, how they can't let go of anything?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's a kind of absolute extreme of an inability to let go. And it can't, and often when you, and this is where the compassionate bit comes from, and instead of sort of thinking of crazy person, blah, 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 often when you look at those people and I read some really interesting interviews around this, who are extreme hoarders, is often a grief that they haven't managed to overcome. And so they're holding on to everything, as it's almost like a protection. It's like a
Mm.
protecting themselves, barraging themselves in. And our lungs are like the third, our skin is like the third lung. So it is our protection. It's our sort of buffer with the outside world. And I can only imagine in people that really hoard things, it's because they're trying to build up that protection around them.
That's so interesting. I didn't know that. Yeah.
Well, that is what I have deduced from really understanding the metal element in Chinese medicine, so the lung and large intestine, and then looking at people's behavior and interviewing people over periods of time. And it's coupled, the lungs are coupled with the large intestine. So of course the lungs breathe in new air and the large intestine lets go of waste. So we often get constipation, problems with the digestion. Yeah, so acupuncture and grief counseling and can be really, really helpful.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really helpful.
Really great information for people. And
Yeah.
again, the more we understand about everything, the more compassionate we can be, can't we? Because
Yeah.
so often we're judging other people's experiences and the ways that they do things, but it always comes back to something, like you say, like a fear or a trauma.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and I have had a lot of pain in my life, but actually all the pain I've had in my life has been a gateway to greater levels of healing. So
Yeah. So the final question is, could you have your own definition of conscious grief, what you believe it means to grieve consciously?
yes, and I thought I'd just go ab lib with this one, and I've probably talked about bits of it up until now, with it always already within this, but I think it's about having an awareness, and being tender with yourself, and allowing yourself that space to grieve, and to be curious about the process of it. Everything that's been very difficult in my life, if I have curiosity, fascination, and compassion, then I'm able to deal with almost anything. So the curiosity is like, okay, instead of fear, instead of going into the fear, I'm gonna be curious about this. Perhaps it's here to teach me or show me something. So instead of kind of going into victim mode of, oh, woe is me, blah blah blah, you also don't want to deny the pain, because that's a suppression. So there's a few stances here, aren't there? There's, let's suppress this and pretend it's not happening, stiff upper lip. That is not conscious.
Yeah.
Toxic positivity is not conscious either, because that's like, I'm fine. I'm just fine.
Yeah.
And I think the conscious grief is somewhere in the middle. And it's not a fixed state either. It moves, and it has energy within it and of itself. So I think it's connecting to it in a way that you're not suppressing, and you're not being spiritual.
Like bypassing.
Yeah, bypassing, thank you. But that you're dancing with it somewhere in the middle. And I think curiosity and fascination really, really help. And I think compassion really helps, self-compassion. And I can often spot, sometimes now, if I have someone reacting to me in a way that I feels unkind or uncompassionate. And of course, I'm in hospitals a lot, so sometimes you're not always met by someone kind and compassionate. I'm mostly able to say now, it's usually because they're not giving compassion to themselves, or it's probably because they're working in a system that is at absolute breaking point. So instead of going into my grief and my fear and my victimhood around, this is so terrible, I'm able to see it at a slightly different level. And I think the same with grief. I think when we can meet grief and dance with it and know it, and really have reverence for it, then I think that is conscious grief. But I think the other two states, it's almost easier to say what it isn't. It's that dance that goes on between, where beauty exists but pain exists. There's still beautiful moments in grief, my God. Like when I've been in real grief, I'm able to access beauty and awe and wonder in the world in a way that most muggles can't.
Yeah.
Because it does give you that real deep appreciation. So I think we need to get out of this place where we just say grief is bad.
Right.
Grief is hard. Labor is hard. When we give birth, that's hard, but it's still awesome and beautiful and full of potential. And I feel the same about grief, to be honest.
I absolutely love that. Thank
Oh.
you. Everything you said, so poetic and amazing.
Nice.
Is there anything else you'd like to share before we finish?
No, I think that just we all need to show up in the world from a place of kindness and compassion, because you never know what people are going through, and sometimes they aren't able to access it themselves. And I really think the spiritual path, and the path that we, probably the people that are going to be listening to this, is that we've mostly done a lot of work on ourselves, right? And I think the question that we need to be asking now is, who needs me now? Because that's the way that we step outside of our own small me self, and that's the way we become we. And I think if we are going to evolve into more conscious human beings, which I believe we are in the process of doing that, then we have to ask the questions outside of the small me. And a really good place to start is, who needs me now?
Love that. Thank you so much, Emma. It has been pure joy talking to you. I'm very, very grateful to meet you, and for all the work that you do and all the compassion. Your father, as you said, was a very compassionate man, and he certainly left that trait with you. So thank
You
you.
learnt me good.